For more on the situation in Mali and the wider region in North Africa, we get two views. J. Peter Pham is director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And retired Colonel Cedric Leighton had a 26-year career in the Air Force, where he focused on intelligence and did a number of stints in the Middle East. He now has his own risk management consulting firm. Peter Pham, you heard Lindsay Hilsum talk about France kicking the hornet's nest. Do you agree that the action in Algeria signals a regionalization of this conflict, that it's a very different thing now?
Very much so. Although it's been a regional challenge for some time, except that our attention wasn't focused upon it. But to remind us, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb certainly staged this event. I think they had several goals in mind. Certainly, if they had been successful, grab a few more hostages. They're already holding half a dozen French hostages. These would add to the number that they could use and leverage. But also, what's interesting is what they didn't do. They didn't blow up that gas installation. It was a reminder to the Algerian government that we can strike. We didn't choose to do so this time, but next time we can hit your vital oil and natural gas facilities, which supply, by the way, 1/5 of Europe's energy needs. So there are some serious implications that could come out of this.
You've got a NATO partner in France fighting against a guerrilla army in Mali. It's not an easy task, is it?
Not at all. And from a logistical standpoint, I thought the ITN reporter was spot on when she talked about the logistical issues that are inherent in any kind of war, but they're particularly inherent in one where the climate is difficult, where the terrain is almost impossible, and where you're really not used to configuring your forces in a way that allows you to move rapidly in this kind of a terrain. It's very much akin to the American Southwest, and it is a very, very difficult area, not only from the standpoint of things like temperature and mountains and things of that nature. It's the nature of the terrain that makes it very difficult to move from one point to another.
Now, we've been covering the fight in Mali over the last several days, but Algeria hasn't been in the news for a long time. What's the state of play there? Who's running the place?
Well, there's a government in Algeria. It's one that probably we would describe as formally a republic, but an authoritarian state. It's certainly not a democracy. It's the one North African country that really hasn't seen the Arab Spring. The extremists in northern Mali, many of the leaders come from Algeria. They're veterans of that war. Mokhtar Belmokhtar, the one who was responsible for this attack, is an Algerian, gone to Afghanistan, came back, fought in Algeria for a while, then moved south as pressure was put upon him, and now he's obviously making a play back in Algeria again.
So are a lot of the countries across the Sahara vulnerable to this kind of activity?
Every single country across the Sahara is vulnerable to this kind of activity. You know, you talk about Algeria. Peter mentioned that this is in essence, an authoritarian government. Authoritarian governments, by their very nature, are brittle governments. They're authoritarian for a reason, because they don't allow their population to do things, because they don't dare allow the population to do things like democratic movements, peaceful assembly, things that we take for granted in the United States. But every single country, if you take Mali, you look at Mauritania, which is to the west of Mali. If you look to the east of Mali, you have the country of Niger. Huge uranium deposits in Niger, fourth largest producer of uranium in the world. These are the kinds of things that could happen to each of these areas, and they could then spread south into other parts of Africa. The French presence in the Ivory Coast is another big factor in all of this, and it allows them a logistical jumping off point for the conflict in Mali, but it is also a vulnerable area which has had its own difficulties of late.
You mentioned the Arab Spring. Was the fall of Gaddafi in Libya something that lit the fuse across these other countries?
I wouldn't say it lit the fuse. I call it, to follow on that metaphor, perhaps it was the accelerant. There was always a spark. Northern Mali had been marginalized politically and economically for some time. The Tuaregs were seeking some legitimate grievances to be redressed. But then all of a sudden you had fighters with experience freed up, former mercenaries with Gaddafi. You had enormous stockpiles of weapons unleashed, and you've had Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has for 10 years now been a pretty good criminal organization, making money off kidnapping for ransom, protecting narco traffickers, other contraband. And then they had with this war chest, they took it to market when the weapons became available and the fighters, and now they're in business.
So you mentioned all the natural endowments of these lands. They're very sparsely populated, practically empty, you might
Right.
say. Does the United States have a real interest in what goes on here, and how does it express that interest without getting involved?
It becomes very difficult. The real interest, Ray, that we have is to make sure that this does not become another jumping off point for an al-Qaeda-like organization to attack the rest of the world. And that's the big danger. That's why the French acted. They believe that this is their version of Afghanistan, in essence. In other words, a base for militant groups to use to attack the homeland, in this case, metropolitan France, the French part of Europe. And for the United States, of course, it's extremely important that the European integrity be kept whole. And then when you look at other things that could possibly happen, you look at the possible cutting off of uranium supplies and other energy supplies from this part of the world, natural gas in the case of Algeria, oil in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, uranium in Niger. All of these things become exceptionally important. And if, for example, in Nigeria, which is further south, if the oil supply from there is disrupted, that could have a significant effect on the oil markets and on all of our strategic interests in and around the world.
In recent years, the United States opened an Africa command. What does it do, and would it be naturally involved in either watching or actively participating in suppressing this Malian revolt?
Well, certainly the Africa Command will have responsibility when our civilian leaders decide what it is that America is going to do here. As Cedric just said, we clearly have interests in the region, but we need to define our objectives. And the French, actually, to be quite frank, need to define their objectives. So far, we've gotten sort of a grab bag of lists of desiderata, but we need objectives defined, and then we need to match resources and means and approaches to achieving those objectives. And I think that's the key to managing the challenge we have here. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves quickly sucked into a veritable quagmire.
But it is a big challenge?
It is a huge challenge, and to play off of Peter's point, it's absolutely essential. In essence, what we're talking about here is developing a real strategy, and a strategy is the ends that you're seeking, the means that you use to get to those ends, and the way in which you do that. So it's an ends, ways, and means type equation that you have to go through from a military perspective. And if the ends, ways, and means aren't clear, then we get into a position where you can actually get into a quagmire. It would be very, very difficult to extricate ourselves from, and that is the big danger with Mali. You don't want that to happen. You want to contain what's going on there, and you want to make it a very clear delineation between the areas that are held by the Tuaregs and Ansar al-Din and all of those people, as well as the government in Mali. And that whole governmental structure, of course, is subject to change.
Cedric Leighton, Peter Pham, thank you both.
Thank you.
Pleasure.